It was supposed to be a quiet evening. A routine shift, nothing out of the ordinary. I just finished my patrol through the neighborhood and was parked in the back of the precinct, sipping stale coffee, waiting for the inevitable radio call. The night shift always felt like this, the quiet before the storm. But when the call came, it wasn't like anything I had ever heard before. "Officer Davis, we've got a report of a suspicious vehicle at the old diner on 4th and Maple. It's been there for hours, and no one's come out. Check it out." At first, it seemed like a regular request. Suspicious vehicles weren't rare in our town. It was a stretch of road no one really traveled at night. The diner had been closed for years, ever since the owner disappeared under strange circumstances. But hey, people still parked there. A quick drive-by to confirm, and I could get back to my coffee. I drove down 4th Street, the headlights cutting through the creeping fog. The diner came into view, its neon sign flickering weakly, casting an eerie glow on the cracked pavement. The car was parked in front of the building, an old rusted sedan that looked like it had been there for decades. No one was around. I pulled over, switched on my flashlight, and stepped out. As I approached the sedan, I felt something off. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The place was too quiet, the air too still, like it was holding its breath. I tapped on the window. No movement. No sign of life. So, I moved around to the driver's side and peered in. The seat was empty. But that wasn't the part that got to me. It was the sticky note on the dashboard. Handwritten, in sharp, frantic handwriting, "You're too late." I stood frozen for a moment. It was just a note. But it felt like a warning. Before I could think about it any longer, I heard something, a soft, muffled noise, coming from inside the diner. I paused, listening carefully. It wasn't a wind sound or the usual creak of an old building. This was different. Someone was in there. And it wasn't a normal someone. I called it in, but my radio crackled back in a burst of static. "Davis, you there? We've got a problem, hold tight." Great, now I was alone, with a weird feeling in my gut and no backup. Something told me this wasn't just another false alarm. I walked toward the diner door, my flashlight flickering slightly as I reached out for the cold metal handle. My heart was pounding in my chest. As I turned the handle, the door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The diner was like a snapshot frozen in time. Dust-covered tables, half-empty salt shakers, and a counter that hadn't seen business in years. But the strangest part? It smelled fresh, like food was just prepared. As if someone had been cooking in there recently, though no one was in sight. And then, I saw it. A trail of something dark, sticky, leading from the back kitchen door. I didn't have to follow it. I knew what it was. Blood. It led me to the kitchen, where I found something that made my stomach twist. A man. His body was slumped on the floor, pale, eyes wide open in terror. There was no mistaking it, he was dead. And what chilled me to the bone wasn't just the brutal way he'd been killed. No, it was the fact that someone had carefully arranged his body, like a sick, twisted scene out of a nightmare. And then I heard the noise again. A soft shuffle, followed by a low, guttural whisper. I froze. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the body, or if it was something worse, something far beyond what my training had ever prepared me for. I wasn't alone. The whispering continued, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I knew I shouldn't have been standing there, frozen, but I couldn't move. Something primal in me told me to stay still. To not draw attention to myself. But then it stopped. I took a slow breath, trying to steady my pulse, and I moved toward the source of the sound, slowly, carefully. As I approached the corner of the kitchen, I flicked my flashlight toward the shadows. The light bounced off an old metal shelf, a few scattered cans, and then, I saw him. Or rather, it. A figure hunched in the farthest corner, just outside the beam of my light. At first, I thought it was some trick of the shadows, the kind your mind creates when you're too tired or jumpy. But then the figure moved. Not in a normal way. It jerked, like it wasn't used to its own body. Every movement seemed unnatural. My stomach lurched, and I instinctively reached for my gun, even though I knew it wouldn't be enough if things escalated. I shouted, "Show yourself. Police." But my voice came out shaky, as though it didn't quite belong to me. The figure didn't respond. It simply stared at me from the darkness, its head tilted at an almost impossible angle, like it was studying me. Its eyes. No, they weren't eyes. They were just black pits, voids that sucked in the light and made everything around them seem darker. I couldn't look away. I couldn't move. Then, the figure spoke. No, it didn't speak. It whispered, but in a language I couldn't understand. The words didn't make sense. They weren't even words, they were like distorted sounds, twisted syllables that grated against my eardrums. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog. But the sounds persisted, louder now, almost like they were in my head. Suddenly, the figure lunged toward me, and I instinctively fired. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the diner, deafening in the silence, but when the smoke cleared, nothing. It was gone. Just like that. Vanished. I was shaking now, heart hammering in my chest. I backed up to the kitchen door, ready to bolt out of there, but then I heard something that stopped me in my tracks, footsteps. Heavy, slow, deliberate. I turned. A second figure, this one more solid than the first, stood in the doorway of the kitchen, blocking the exit. This one didn't have the same twisted movements, but it felt wrong. The way it stood, just beyond the threshold, it felt like it was watching me, waiting. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't fight it. And I certainly couldn't just walk away. I looked around, trying to find anything I could use. But the diner was barren, devoid of any useful tools. The flashlight in my hand was my only weapon, but it barely illuminated the figure before me. The footsteps came closer, now in sync with my own racing heartbeat. And then, it spoke. Too late. You're already marked. Before I could react, a wave of cold washed over me, and my flashlight flickered once more, casting long shadows across the room. I could barely make out the figure's face as it moved closer, the edges of its features flickering like they were made of shadows themselves. It was grinning at me, its mouth stretching far too wide, unnaturally wide. Panic set in. I stumbled backward, trying to move, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The weight of whatever this thing was pressed in on me, suffocating me with its presence. I heard the voice again, but this time, it was clearer. You shouldn't have come here. In that instant, I realized I wasn't dealing with something human. I wasn't even sure I was dealing with something from this world. The flashlight went out completely. I don't know how long I stood there in the pitch-black darkness. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest, I thought it might explode. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the silence around me felt unnatural, like the whole world had gone mute. Then, the whispering returned. Not in words, just a low hum, vibrating through the air, as if the very walls of the diner were speaking to me. And those footsteps. Slowly, deliberately, getting closer. I had to move. I snapped into action, my instincts kicking in, overriding the fear. I fumbled with my flashlight, but the damn thing wouldn't turn back on. I needed to get out, and I needed to get out now. With my gun in one hand, I backed away from the figure, eyes straining to make out any detail in the dark. I could feel its presence, feel it getting closer, and I could hear it now, its breath, deep and ragged, like it was suffocating itself. And then I heard something else. A sound I hadn't noticed before, the faint scraping of metal against the floor. It was dragging something. Something heavy. I moved toward the back door, hands trembling, but the kitchen seemed so much farther now. The oppressive air, the shadows, it was as though the diner itself was swallowing me up. I couldn't see, but I could feel the presence looming behind me, closing in. I couldn't even look over my shoulder, I was terrified of what I might see. The scraping stopped. And then, the low whisper again. "You shouldn't have come here." My pulse skyrocketed, and panic set in again. I had no plan anymore, no strategy, just survival. My only thought was to get to the front door. But as I rounded the corner of the kitchen, I froze. There was a figure standing in the doorway. Not the one I had seen earlier. This one was different. Taller. Darker. Its face was a void, a deep, impenetrable darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it, making everything feel darker still. I could see the outline of its limbs, long and twisted. The arms, unnaturally long, hung loosely at its sides. It had no eyes. It didn't need eyes. And in that moment, I knew that I wasn't dealing with a human being anymore. It was something else. Something old. Something that had existed long before my time. I stepped back, my gun raised instinctively, but it didn't flinch. Didn't move. But then, it spoke again. "You're here. You belong here." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even think. It was as though the air had thickened, pressing in on me, suffocating me with its weight. I was shaking violently now, unable to control my own body. My mind was racing, trying to process what was happening, but everything felt wrong. My thoughts felt muddled, distant. And that's when I realized. I couldn't leave. The door that had been wide open just moments ago now seemed miles away. My legs wouldn't cooperate. The shadows themselves were closing in, curling around me like living things, blocking my every escape. I backed up into the counter, nearly falling, but the thing in front of me didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, its form flickering in and out of existence like it was half here and half somewhere else. And then it spoke, its voice a low growl that reverberated in my chest. "We don't let anyone leave." In a panic, I squeezed the trigger. 3 shots. The loud cracks echoed in the small diner, but the figure didn't flinch. The bullet seemed to pass through it. I froze, staring in horror as the holes in the thing's form began to close up, the darkness healing itself. That was when I knew for sure. I was trapped. And whatever was in that diner wasn't going to let me go. And then, the door slammed shut. I was completely and utterly alone. The door slammed with a deafening crash, the final barrier between me and whatever nightmare I was trapped in. The air grew colder, the oppressive weight of the shadows pressing in tighter. I was running on pure instinct now, fear was my only guide. My flashlight had died. My gun felt useless. My mind was scrambling to make sense of everything, but it couldn't. Nothing made sense. The thing in the doorway wasn't just watching anymore. It had moved. Slowly, like it was savoring every second of my panic, it started toward me, its long limbs dragging along the floor, the scrape of its feet sending shivers down my spine. I couldn't run, I couldn't escape. Every step I took backward was met with a wall of thick, unrelenting darkness. I stumbled, falling against a table, knocking over a chair. The clatter echoed through the diner, but the creature didn't seem to care. It was closer now, its presence pressing down on me like a vice. Why are you doing this?" My voice cracked as I spoke, the words barely escaping my lips. It didn't answer. It never did. Instead, its shape seemed to warp, the darkness around it flickering, twisting. It was like a living shadow, something that existed outside the rules of this world. A thing from the depths of nightmares. And then I heard it, the scraping sound again. I glanced to the side. The first figure, the one I had seen in the back corner of the kitchen, was now walking toward me from the other side of the diner. It wasn't human. Its movements were jerky, like it was struggling to control its own body, as if it wasn't used to having one. Its mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, stretching far beyond what any mouth should. It hissed, the sound like nails scraping across glass. I was trapped. I had no idea how long I had been in that diner by then. Minutes? Hours? Time felt meaningless. The world had become a blur of darkness and fear. The two figures were closing in on me, one from the back and one from the front. I reached out blindly, my hands grasping at anything. My fingers brushed against something cold. A metal rod. A pipe. Without thinking, I picked it up, gripping it tightly, my fingers slick with sweat. The first figure was almost on me. It moved in a sickening, disjointed way, its body jerking and twitching as if it couldn't quite figure out how to be real. I raised the metal pipe, swinging it wildly at the air in front of me. The moment the metal made contact, there was an ear-piercing screech. The figure recoiled, stumbling back. But it didn't stay down. It wasn't hurt. It wasn't human. I backed up into the corner, desperate, trying to think. My mind raced through every possible scenario, but there was no escape. Then the second figure, the one that had been blocking the door, took another step forward. It was so close now, so close I could feel the cold emanating from its form. It spoke, but not in words, more like a rasping breath that rattled the bones in my chest. "You're ours now." A sound, the sound of a dozen footsteps, came from the far side of the diner, and I turned, panic rising. A third figure, this one more solid, more real than the others, had emerged from the shadows. It was tall, towering over me, its face completely obscured by darkness. It didn't move, just stood there, silently watching. My heart hammered in my chest. 3. There were 3 now. I couldn't see how I could fight this. I didn't know how to survive this. The more I swung the metal pipe, the more they seemed to multiply. The more I tried to run, the more they surrounded me, their presence suffocating me, filling every inch of the diner. I fired another round into the air, hoping for a miracle. The sound of gunfire seemed to send the shadows into a frenzy. They hissed, screeched, but they didn't retreat. Instead, the first figure stepped forward, its face, if you could call it a face, bending and warping into something even more grotesque. It was like the dark shape was looking at me now, its twisted smile spreading impossibly wide. "Run," the thing hissed in that distorted voice, "but there's nowhere to hide." It's the last thing I remember hearing clearly. And then, everything went black. I woke up on the cold floor, my head throbbing like someone had cracked it open with a sledgehammer. My hands were still gripping the metal pipe, but my fingers were numb. My body was stiff, like I'd been unconscious for far too long. The air around me felt thick, heavy, suffocating. For a moment, I thought I was still dreaming. That this was all some horrible nightmare. But the stale scent of blood, the metallic taste in the back of my throat, those things were all too real. I forced myself to sit up, my mind still foggy, but the overwhelming sense of dread returned in an instant. The diner was still dark. Too dark. The only light came from the dying neon sign outside, flickering weakly through the dirty windows. But it wasn't just the darkness that unsettled me. It was the silence. Not a single sound. No whispering, no footsteps, no low growls. Just the weight of stillness pressing in on me. I scanned the diner, my eyes darting around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. And that's when I saw it, something I hadn't noticed before. The man. The body. The one I had found in the kitchen. It wasn't there anymore. A sickening chill crawled up my spine. The bloodstain was still there, dark and dried, but the body was gone, leaving only an empty space in the center of the room. And then I saw it. In the corner, near the old booth, there was something moving. Something small, creeping along the floor like a shadow. My breath caught in my throat. It was too dark to see clearly, but I could make out a shape, a silhouette, like a thing slithering on the ground. I squinted, my heart racing. It was like the shadows themselves were moving, alive. I gripped the pipe harder, standing slowly. My legs felt weak, but I couldn't afford to collapse now. Not when whatever was out there was hunting me. The shape in the corner moved again, and I took a step forward, my eyes widening as I saw the full form. It was a man. Or at least, it had been once. His body was contorted, bent at unnatural angles, his limbs twisted like broken branches. His face, if you could call it a face, was gone, replaced by something wrong. His skin was stretched thin over his skull, as if it had been pulled tight. His mouth was open, too wide, too stretched, and his eyes, were nothing more than empty sockets. He turned toward me, his head jerking unnaturally, and I could hear the scraping sound again. He wasn't alone. I turned, desperate to escape, but as I did, I froze. There, at the entrance to the diner, was the figure. The tall, dark one. The one that had spoken, the one who had been blocking the door earlier. It was standing there, still and silent, watching me. It stepped forward, and as it did, the shadows seemed to follow it, crawling along the walls like they were alive. I could feel the air around me getting colder, the walls closing in. I was trapped. There was no way out. "You're ours," the figure said again, its voice deep and echoing, reverberating through the walls of the diner. "There is no escape. Not from us." My throat tightened as fear surged through me. The darkness was swallowing the diner whole. There was no light, no escape. The shadows moved with a life of their own, and the figures, those twisted, monstrous things, were closing in on me. I backed up, my hands shaking. "I'll fight you," I whispered, but the words felt hollow, useless. The figure laughed. It wasn't a laugh. It was more like the scraping of stone against metal, an unnatural sound that scraped at the inside of my skull. The walls seemed to press in on me, the shadows thickening, crowding out everything else. The air was freezing now, and the temperature dropped so quickly I could see my breath. And then, in the distance, I heard it. A sound like a door creaking open. A real door. The front door. I rushed toward the sound without thinking, my body moving on pure instinct. I had no idea if it was a trap or if I was just losing my mind, but I didn't care. I reached the door, yanked it open, and there was nothing. Just blackness. A deep, suffocating void that stretched endlessly into the night. I could feel the figures behind me now, their presence crushing. I turned around, just in time to see the first one step forward, its grotesque form filling the space between us. It was too late. There was no escape. But then, in a moment of clarity, I realized something. The figures weren't attacking me. They weren't killing me. Not yet. They were waiting. They wanted me to stay. And I realized then that I wasn't going to survive this. But I had to make sure someone else would know. Someone had to hear this story, to know what happened here. To know what was still here. I raised my gun one last time, even though I knew it was useless. The darkness crept in, and everything went cold. But I'll be damned if they'll take my story too. I don't know how much time passed after I last fired that gun. Hours? Days? The walls of the diner, or whatever twisted version of it I was trapped in, started to blur together. The cold was unbearable now, and I could feel the weight of the shadows pressing down on me like a physical force. I wasn't sure if I was awake or dreaming anymore, if I was even alive. But then something happened that snapped me back to reality. I heard a voice. It wasn't the whispers I had heard before. It wasn't the rasping growls of the creatures lurking in the dark. This voice was clear, human. Help, it was weak. Fragile. A cry for mercy, and it came from somewhere deep within the diner. A faint sound, like a breath carried on the wind. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I thought maybe I wasn't alone anymore. I stumbled forward, despite every bone in my body screaming at me to stop. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold on to the pipe. But I had to follow the voice. I had to know what was happening. The shadows seemed to shift around me, pulling back just enough for me to make out shapes. The diner was eerily still. Too still. I crept deeper, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the cold air biting into my skin. Then, I saw it. The figure, lying on the floor, crumpled in a heap in the corner by the counter. A man. Another one. He was pale, his clothes torn, covered in something dark, something red. I rushed toward him, adrenaline flooding my veins. But as I got closer, I saw the truth. He wasn't breathing. His eyes were wide open, frozen in terror, and there were deep gashes on his arms, his chest, like something had clawed at him. His face was contorted in a silent scream. And then, his eyes shifted. They blinked. He was still alive. I fell to my knees beside him, reaching out to touch his shoulder, but the moment my hand made contact with his skin, the world around us seemed to shift. The diner rippled, like a bad television signal, the air warping and distorting. I gasped and pulled back, my heart racing. What was happening? What were these things? The man's eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, his lips parted to speak. You need to leave, now. It's too late for me. But you can still escape. I shook my head. I can't leave you like this. You're not dead yet. His lips twisted into a painful, almost pleading grimace. No. It's already too late. They're waiting. They're always waiting, for the next one. I wanted to ask him what he meant. I wanted to demand an explanation, but before I could, the temperature in the room dropped even further, and the shadows behind him seemed to shift again. The diner was alive with dark, crawling things. Shapes that flickered and writhed at the edges of my vision. And then, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. I looked up, and there, standing at the entrance to the kitchen, was the tall, dark figure again. The one who had spoken before. And it was holding something. Something small. Something human. I squinted, trying to make out the figure more clearly, but then it stepped forward and I saw it. A child. A child, no older than 5, clutching a teddy bear. My blood ran cold. The child's eyes were wide and glassy, staring at me without recognition. But what froze me more than anything was the way the creature moved, guiding the child toward me, as if the child was a puppet. The figure wasn't hurting the child, not yet, but I knew the truth. This was what they did. This was how they hunted. They didn't just kill. They took, they twisted. They bent reality itself to draw in the next soul. And now, the next soul was staring at me. I couldn't breathe. The man on the floor whispered again, his voice barely audible, "Run, now, they're not done with you, yet." But how could I run? The diner, the shadows, the figures, they were all closing in. There was nowhere to go. And that child, if I didn't do something, it would be next. I staggered to my feet, still gripping the pipe, my hands numb from the cold. The child's eyes blinked, and it opened its mouth to speak. But instead of a child's voice, it spoke in the same low, growling tone as the creature. "You're ours now." And just like that, the world around me snapped back into place. The shadows screamed, the air thickened, and the temperature plunged even lower. I wasn't just fighting for my life anymore. I was fighting for my soul. I turned, looking for an escape, but the diner was closing in, the walls shifting and distorting. The figures stepped forward, their shapes warping like they were made of liquid darkness. The child was still staring at me, its small hands clutching the teddy bear as the dark figure behind it drew closer. I had no more time. There was no more time left. And then, just as the first hand reached out toward me, everything went dark. I thought I was done for. I thought the darkness had swallowed me whole. But in that final moment, something snapped, something deep inside me. I couldn't let it end like this. I wouldn't let it. Not while there was a breath left in me. The child's hollow eyes locked onto mine, and for a split second, I saw it. The flicker of humanity beneath the mask of whatever had twisted that poor thing into a puppet of the shadows. I saw its fear. It was as trapped as I was. I didn't think. I just acted. I raised the metal pipe with all the strength I had left, swinging it toward the dark figure guiding the child. The impact wasn't what I expected. It wasn't a solid hit, more like I was swinging through smoke. But the figure recoiled. It hissed, a sound that grated against my bones, and for a moment, I thought I had actually heard it. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I shoved the pipe into the figure's chest, forcing it back. The shadows writhed around us, but I kept pushing. I had no choice. But then, something worse happened. The walls began to crack, fractures spreading across the diner's foundation like a web, as if the place itself was beginning to tear apart. And with it, the shadows began to scream. I didn't look back at the child. I couldn't. I just kept swinging the pipe, desperate to hold back whatever was coming for me. The dark figure staggered, its shape flickering in and out of existence. It growled again, but this time, it sounded frightened. Leave. Leave now, it hissed, its voice rattling as if it couldn't fully hold its form together. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I didn't care about the diner or the twisted horrors inside. I just needed to get out. The door was still open. I could see the faint glow of streetlights cutting through the blackness outside. I ran toward it, my legs burning, my lungs gasping for air. Behind me, the sounds of the figure's pursuit faded as the diner began to collapse. The air itself seemed to buckle, twisting like it was tearing away from reality. I reached the door, barely able to see through the fog of my own fear, and I threw myself into the night. I was outside. I didn't stop. My feet pounded the pavement, the cold air biting at my face as I sprinted away, as far as I could. I didn't look back. When I finally collapsed against the side of a building, gasping for air, I had no idea how far I had run. The sounds of the diner, of those creatures, had faded. But I knew one thing. I had survived. For now. But they were still there. The shadows. The figures. I could feel them. They had marked me. And somewhere, out there, in the deep places where the darkness waits, they were watching. I thought about the man on the floor, the child, the others who had been taken. What had happened to them? I didn't know if I would ever find out. But I had a feeling that this wasn't over. That they wouldn't let me go. They wanted me to join them. But I wouldn't. I wasn't sure what had happened in that diner. But I would never forget it. And I would never stop telling the story. Because if I didn't, they would take my voice, too. But I had survived. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough.